This morning's Bible reading is from two chapters, first Numbers 13:27 to 33. And this is the spies who had been sent to the land of Canaan, who had come back to speak to the Israelites. They presented themselves before Moses and Aaron and the whole congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They reported to the whole congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told the story of their trip. We went to the land to which you sent us, and oh, it does flow with milk and honey. Just look at this fruit. The only thing is that the people who live there are fierce. Their cities are huge and well fortified. Worse yet, we saw descendants of the giant Anak. Amalekites are spread out in the Negev. Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites hold the hill country, and the Canaanites are established on the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan. Caleb interrupted, called for silence before Moses and said, "Let us go up and take the land now. We can do it." But the others said, "We can't attack these people. They're way stronger than we are." They spread scary rumours among the people of Israel. They said, "We scouted out the land from one end to the other. It's a land that swallows people whole. Everybody we saw was huge. Why, we even saw the Nephilim giants, the Anak giants, come from the Nephilim. Alongside them, we felt like grasshoppers, and they looked down on us as if we were grasshoppers." And then the second reading is from Genesis 12:9 to 13:2. And Abram kept moving steadily, making his way south to the Negev. Then a famine came to the land. Abram went down to Egypt to live. It was a hard famine. As he drew near to Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "Look, we both know that you're a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, 'Aha, that's his wife,' and kill me. But they'll let you live. Do me a favour. Tell them you're my sister. Because of you, they'll welcome me and they'll let me live." When Abram arrived in Egypt, the Egyptians took one look and saw that his wife was stunningly beautiful. Pharaoh's princes raved over her to Pharaoh. She was taken to live with Pharaoh. Because of her, Abram got along very well. He accumulated sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men and women servants, and camels. But God hit Pharaoh hard because of Abram's wife, Sarai. Everyone in the palace got seriously sick. Pharaoh called for Abram. "What's this that you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she's your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I'd take her as my wife? Here's your wife, take her back and get out." Pharaoh ordered his men to get Abram out of the country. They sent him and his wife and everything he owned on their way. So Abram left Egypt and went back to the Negev, he and his wife and everything he owned, and Lot still with him. By now, Abram was very rich, loaded with cattle and silver and gold.
Thank you very much for sharing there, Helen. And what a great man Abraham is. He came so close to getting it right. "Darling, you know you're beautiful. I know you're beautiful. But hey, I'm a bit scared. Can you please protect me from what might happen?" Well, welcome to church today. If you're online, it's wonderful to be with you. And if you're in the room, I'm really glad to be able to stand here with you guys, or as you sit, to just share some thoughts. My name's Nick Harris, and today we're in part 6 of our Soul Care series. Part 6. And we're looking at overcoming fears. Overcoming fears. And I wonder, as you sit in the room, if you knew you were coming to church to talk about fear. And if you knew you were going to come to church to talk about fear, would you have stayed at home? Or would you have jumped in the car, done the best you could to possibly get here early? Which one would it have been? I also wonder if you've actually spent much time thinking about what your fears actually are. Have you ever stopped to consider, what is it that I'm afraid of? One of the things on my bucket list is to go on a luxury cruise. Has anyone been on a cruise before? Just show of hands. Anyone been on a cruise before? Right, all you people are living my dream. But here's the thing. My wife grew up in the late 90s, and like every teenager in the late 90s, she absolutely loved the film Titanic. Spoiler alert, when you watch a film on repeat where an unsinkable ship sinks, your heart breaks repeatedly, but also you get embedded with this fear. You see, two things have come out of this season in her life. Number one, she will not hop on a cruise ship because she has this fear that she's going to be in the middle of nowhere, water surrounding her, trapped in the room as the ship goes down. And then just before she dies, Jaws is going to break in and eat her all up. Long point short, I'm not getting my luxury cruise ever. Fears. I wonder if you stop to think about what your fears are. Perhaps it's height. Maybe that when you think of standing up, even on something like the stage, looking down, all of a sudden, no. Maybe your vice is that you are afraid of spiders. They're tiny, they have unnaturally large numbers of legs, they're hairy, and they can get you in your sleep. Good luck sleeping tonight. Perhaps the thought of speaking in public, if you were me right now, you just could not fathom being in this position. Maybe standing in front of people reminds you that you actually do have these tiny hairs on your back as they stand up. Maybe a holiday is marred by the fact that before you can get to that luxurious destination, you have to hop onto a plane. Could it be that you've got this pride that you're actually a clean freak? But when you're really, really honest with yourself, you're not really clean because you're organized or anything like that. It's because you're a germaphobe. And the thought of having mess in your kitchen or in your bedroom or in your closet is enough to give you the sweats, which means you have to clean all over again. If you've stopped to think about fear before, you'll realize that if you are alive, there is a guarantee that you're going to run into fear at some point. There's no escaping it. And so it makes perfect sense that God would give us this incredible book or collection of books called the Bible, and the most repeated refrain in Scripture would be some version of, fear not, do not be afraid, take courage. And I think as we read through Scripture, we often don't stop to recognize the impact of fear. But as I was preparing, I just thought every single story just about has somewhere got fear driving the motivations of the people within. In fact, one of the great challenges now is to read back and start to recognize how big the spectrum of fear is and to see how it shapes things. I've chosen a few that are really well known to us because they've been in the series a little bit, but let's just recap that account in Numbers that was read to us by Helen. The Israelites, they've arrived on the outskirts of the Promised Land. In other words, this is a place that they've been guaranteed is going to be theirs by God. Should be simple, right? But they have good leaders, so they're prudent. They send 12 spies in. They check out the land. And yes, the land that God has promised them has got absolutely everything you could want. Incredible trees, fertile soil, space, water, mountains, you name it, it's there in the Promised Land. It's also got people, fearsome-looking people, people that could potentially be strong. And of the 12, 2 come in and say, hey, look, God has promised us. But the other 10 say, there's a problem, and the problem is too big. One of the things you learn when you attend PDs for psychology is that anxiety is one of the most contagious things. More contagious than any virus going around. And so if there's anxiety present within a group, it has a ripple effect and eventually works its way through absolutely everyone. We see it in Numbers. And the consequence of fear contagiously making its way through is that an entire generation misses the opportunity to enter into their divinely appointed inheritance. And we can skip over that, but that's a tragedy. Right there, it's a tragedy of fear derailing people from the promises that God had made to them. People who had seen so much miraculous. Another example that we talk about often, we remember the leader in the Christian church, Peter. He had spent 3 years journeying with Jesus, seeing miraculous after miraculous events occur. And then one night, in the dead of night, where he's supposed to be praying, but half the time ends up falling asleep. Sound like something you've ever done before? Yep. I've had that happen. Peter's supposed to be praying. He can't really get around to doing this properly. A small group of soldiers comes in and grabs Jesus. He's arrested. And Peter's seen so much, experienced so much, but what's his response? His response when in a little situation with a servant is to say, no, I don't know Jesus. I never hung out with him. He is not in any way, shape, or form part of my posse, my tribe, my family, my connections. Not a chance. Oh yes, Peter's response is to be fearful and to lie. And then we've already talked about Abraham as we started the sermon. Fear caused him to offer up his wife as his sister. And fear also caused him to stop believing in the promises God gave, and so he took his wife's servant to be a second wife. Great husband. When you think about these little illustrations, at the heart of these fears is a little issue of trust. Trust. For the Israelites, fear causes them to distrust God's ability to deliver on a promise. For Peter, at that stage in his life, and I want to emphasize, it is at that stage, because if you know the story of Peter, he does move beyond it, but at that stage in his life, fear caused him to distrust the fact that God is sovereign in every single stage of life, even when there's hardship. Abraham, God makes covenantal promises, which he repeatedly doubts, and because he's fearful, he endangers God's promises. And because he's fearful, he decides to take God's promises, put them to the side, and he takes his own actions. He makes his own decisions independent of God's promises, and he jeopardizes everything. For many years, I worked as a youth pastor, and when I was working in youth ministry, one of the common questions the young people would have for me is, does God love me? How do I know that God is actually going to care about me? It's a fascinating question. I don't know if you've asked yourself recently, how can an all-knowing, all-powerful God love me? And often when we think through that question, we begin to think through the things that aren't so great about ourselves. From the superficial, don't have enough hair on my head, to the deep down on an angry person, or whatever it may be for you. How can such a good, glorious, gracious God love little old me? It's fascinating that that's our question for God, but if we look through Scripture and you look through the stories repeated, what's his question to us? It's, will you trust me? Will you trust me with your day-to-day fears? Will you trust me when your obstacles seem insurmountable? Will you trust me when things go wrong? Will you trust me with your future? Trust. See, trust is tested when there's a challenge. At school, I often have the privilege of speaking to our students. And one of the conversations I have with students fairly regularly, given the population size we have, is about comfort zones. Every single person in this room has a comfort zone. The very first circle in our comfort zone is just that, comfort. And one of the things we need to try to do in life is to make our comfort zone as big as possible. One of the dangers with this is that we can actually shrink our comfort zone so it only includes our bedroom and the kitchen, maybe the bathroom. Which, to be honest, I love those three places, three favorite places in the house: kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. That's my three. I don't know what yours are. But life is not supposed to be lived within the sphere of those walls. Life is supposed to be so much bigger than that space. And so when you start thinking about your comfort zone, what you should be trying to do is expand your comfort zone to make it as big as possible. And it is possible to take your comfort zone so that it includes everything that you currently fear. But there's a challenge. The challenge is, in order to expand your comfort zone, you have to step into what's known as your risk zone, and then you need to safely exit the risk zone. I want you to think about the last time you got a new job. Right, the last time you started something new. Let's use work as an example. Was it a comfortable experience? I suspect not. I remember back many years ago, 2008, some people in this room weren't alive back then, but I remember in 2008 starting work here. It was an incredibly uncomfortable experience. I didn't know who was who. I didn't know how to work these photocopy machine things. I didn't know where to have my lunch and if there was going to be the appropriate microwave to heat up my lunch. And actually, I didn't know if my lunch was going to be the same as everyone else's and do we sit together. I didn't know which the cleanest bathrooms were. There were so many little hurdles that I take for granted that on the first day of work, you just feel really uncomfortable with. But if you ask me right now, is coming to work a comfortable and uncomfortable experience? My answer is quite simply this. I love work. It's incredibly comfortable. In fact, the issue is sometimes I have to remind myself that I have to wear a tie and I have to keep my shoes on. It's not my house. It's a space that has very much become part of who I am, and I operate with absolute and total freedom. How do you make that transition from risk to comfort? Oh, it's by repeatedly entering the risk zone and then exiting it safely, and so your comfort zone expands. The practice of doing this should be used to overcome so many different fears. Have you started to think through some of yours? I grew up in South Africa, and as a child, one of the things that was repeatedly said to me was, snakes are dangerous. Don't touch them. I remember I'd be sitting, I actually have this vivid memory, I was sitting once on these brick steps, right? I'm here, and there's a game reserve person at about this point, and they're holding the snake, and they're saying like this, if this snake were to bite you, you would be dead within minutes. Before we could get an ambulance. No point going to the hospital. If this snake were to bite you, you're dead. And I'm here as a 7 or an 8-year-old going, oh my goodness, get away from me. And the person keeps on placidly, calmly talking. I don't know what gave them peace with that snake, but I certainly did not have that peace. And so until the last 4 years, I've been petrified by snakes. If you were to put an image on a snake on a screen, my heart rate would instantly jump. In the past, talking about snakes would cause me to shiver. That passage in Scripture where the snake is put on the pole is one that I have struggled with for many years because I could not associate healing, as we do in the medical system, with something that is supposed to take life. And then I made this really smart move. We bought a block of land in a place which is fully inhabited by tiger snakes. And I realized that my responsibility is to protect my family. And since I'm an idiot, I put my family in snake land. So what are you going to do about this? Well, options. Get dogs and hope they get the snake first, or the snake gets them. Our dogs cost a fortune. I can't afford for the dogs to die, so I spend a fortune doing snake avoidance training. Other options, send my wife out after the snakes. Call me Abraham. Why not? Other option, face the fear. So I don't know what's on your algorithms, on your social media, but mine is snake videos. I watch snakes lunging at people. I watch snakes that have reportedly eaten people. I don't know what that giant anaconda in some countries got, but it certainly looks more big than a person, and I hope it is. I watch snakes getting released into the wild. I watch snakes getting released into the park that I ride around. The other day, my mother-in-law brought a book into our house because my daughter was doing a project on Oman. It was Arabic snakes. And I don't know whether it was my wife or my mother-in-law, but they put it on the counter facing the spot that I eat from. If you had done this to me 4 years ago, we would have had words. But 4 years have passed. And yes, there was a temptation to turn that book around, to throw that book away. I've left it there. Every meal I have at that table, I'm looking at a brown snake in sand. Every time I want to pass to either the fridge or to my scullery thing, whatever it's called, I have to pass that snake. Every time I walk out the house, that snake book's there. There's now pyrethrum in front of it, but that was one of those two, not me. The simple reality is that as you move from fearing something in the physical responses, as you enter that risk zone and exit it, you grow in comfort. I've now gone and assisted with the removal of snakes from our property on numerous occasions. One time I went barefoot, idiot. But the reality is, though I don't like snakes, and I'm not saying that in front of anyone here, the comfort level has changed because I have stepped in and out of that risk zone. The third circle is the danger zone. I want to be really clear. Apart from a Tom Cruise Top Gun song that might be running through your head, the danger zone always exists. You walk into a war zone, there's bullets flying, unless you're a superhero, there's a danger you might die. You can't get rid of that one. But the trick here is you need to be able to differentiate between actual dangers and imaginary dangers. All right? Because sometimes we substitute an imaginary danger and we cause it to cripple and debilitate us from doing something, when rarely we're safe the whole way through. Comfort zones. It's a really basic theory on how deliberate exposure can help you overcome some of your fears. It's hard because it requires intentional repetition. For example, if you're scared of speaking in public, which I was for many, many years, you have to fight every single fear, pick up a microphone and stand in front of people. The only leftover thing that you can see them afraid of speaking is this water bottle right here. Because as my fear rises up, I need to take a drink. Give me a second. When you think about fear as exposure, safely exiting can create a level of comfort. It's used often. But some fears are not actually like that. Some fears are intrinsically linked to our identity, to generational patterns, to habits we've developed. And when you think of those fears, you need an entirely different approach to tackling them. The first of which is actually just recognizing how we work. When nature pushes us into a situation, our body naturally moves into a fight or flight mode. And when you're in fight or flight mode, you feel vulnerable. And when you feel vulnerable, there's a natural tendency to seek control. So for example, someone who is pushed into flight mode takes control by withdrawing. It could be a physical withdrawal, or it could be emotionally to shut down, to not engage in that conversation or that situation, whatever it is. I remember when I was much younger, I had to study a language. I know we still have to study languages in Australia. I'm guessing most people in this room studied language at some point. My language was French. And I did reasonably well at school, but here's the thing. I've always, and to this day, still struggle with spelling. Any letter that goes out by me has been edited at least twice by other people because I can't spell. The other thing I've struggled with all my life is the fact that I have a weird, changing accent. And people can't always understand the words that are coming out my mouth. And so I went into this French class going, well, hang on a second, what are we doing in this class? We're learning to spell words in another language. I can't do that in English. We're learning to say words in another language. I struggle to do that in English. This subject's not for me. Now, I wouldn't say that I have a fear of failure, but in this particular case, the challenge of another language I put in the too hard basket. And so I decided to take control. And I did that by doing the absolute minimum and quitting as soon as I possibly could. Now, if you were to ask me many years ago, hey, Nick, what are you afraid of? It would have been a very quick answer. Snakes, nothing else. That's what I thought if you would push back maybe 6, 7 years ago. Snakes, nothing else. Nothing else. But I've been working on a few different things in my life and talking to people. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is that when I'm in different situations, what is my emotional and my physical responses? How am I getting triggered when something is going on around me? And as I've been working through this process over the last few years, I've had these two people who I both love and drive me insane because they do speak into my life. And on many occasions, these two people, totally separate from each other, have sat me down and they've spoken incredibly positive words into my potential. And as they've been doing this, I've realized that it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. I don't know how to respond when they say nice things. Thanks. Oh, not a chance. You're way better. I get so awkward in those moments. And my thoughts, they're amplified, and I just want to get out of that situation so incredibly quickly. And I've been thinking about why. And it's like, it's because I'm humble. Nope, not true. I've been thinking about it. And what I've become aware of is that discomfort is actually a symptom of something that's underneath. You see, I would have said snakes, but apparently there's a bit of fear in there because what if I don't live up to those expectations? What if I can't deliver? The one that actually sits in place sometimes in the head is, what if right now, at my age, I'm at the peak of my potential and everything that you think might be coming is actually beyond my reach? Wouldn't that be disappointing? Wouldn't that be disappointing? And perhaps you've asked yourself those same questions. And as you start to think about how fear might impact you at work, well, all of a sudden, instead of stepping into that greater challenge, you begin to look at where you can get instant wins. And getting instant wins is wonderful because you move from success to success to success. But it's a short-term process that's been driven by fear when you look at the heart of it. And what it's really doing is stifling your long-term growth. You see, work might become a comfort zone, but there's many things that happen in life that we take shortcuts in to see instant results. They've been driven by the fact that we're not too sure how to, or we're afraid of how to take next steps. For me, apparently fear and control are intertwined. High school French, really simple. I'm going to control the situation by withdrawing. That's flight mode. If I fail, it's not because I'm dumb. It's because the subject's useless and the teacher can't teach. Boom, done, controlled. It's not about me, it's all about you. Fight mode, a conflict emerges. Interesting. You see, when you think about the word fear, it's linked with the word vulnerability. And sometimes to avoid vulnerability, we step into this fight mode, because in fight mode, fear, if it creates vulnerability, well, what do we do? If we substitute it for anger, get a bit cross, get a bit self-righteous, you feel powerful. Or what if you take fear and you think, oh, fear is a sign of weakness? Well, in fight mode, you take control. Because when you're in control, you're not weak, and you don't have to worry about the unknown. If fear looks like being passive or unproductive, then what you do is you take action because it seems braver than doing nothing. What happens is when you're fearful is that truth gets totally distorted. You may not feel like a fearful person, and I certainly do not feel like a fearful person. You may not feel that way, but if your default response when vulnerability comes in is to take power or to take control or to take action or to resort to anger, that's actually fear playing out in your life, whether you see it or not. And if you want to overcome fear, you have to begin by identifying it. You cannot overcome what you refuse to acknowledge. And I know as an Australian male, with many other countries in between, that to say something like that seems like a very vulnerable, weak thing. But no, if I'm going to move forward, I need to acknowledge that there is a level of fear. You cannot deal with what you will not admit is present. You may not feel like a fearful person. I repeat it, you may not feel like a fearful person. But when situations arise where there's vulnerability, where there's ambiguity, where you're unsure what to do, if your default is always to take control, to take decisive action, to get angry, that's fear driving those responses. And it's not that taking action is the wrong thing to do, it's the motive that we need to deal with. We're very pressed for time, and we're going to continue this conversation on Wednesday. But in his book, if you're reading the book, it's wonderful. If you're following the videos, you get a little bit further. But in his book by Dr. Rob Reimer, he has these 6 ideas and ways you can deal with fear that goes deeper than just exposure. He said that the very first thing, which is what I've said, is that you absolutely have to identify it. The second thing, or the first thing that Rob says, is that when you're encountering fear, you need to begin with worship. You've got to begin with worship, and there's 2 times to worship: when you want to and when you don't want to. And the reason we worship is because when we're worshiping, we take our eyes off whatever it's on, whatever the circumstances are, and we shift our focus onto God. And when you begin to do that, you get clarity. The second thing Rob says is you need to choose gentleness. Gentleness often feels like weakness. Gentleness sometimes feels like you're letting the other person have their way, win that argument. No. Fruits of the Spirit. Oh, gentleness isn't there. So is self-control. Gentleness and self-control go hand in hand. And when you feel like you need to take power and get the last word, and that is you being driven by fear. But when you are gentle, it is not weakness, it is self-control. It is power in action in a way that potentially shifts the conversation to build the other person up and yourself. When the urge comes, that's a signal in your body to slow down, to breathe, and to think more carefully about what's motivating your responses. Third, Rob says God is always present, and we need to remember that God is always present, because peace is a byproduct from fixing our eyes upon Jesus. We need to understand that the peace of God is not determined on outcomes. And so for some of us, we're going to encounter sickness, and we're going to pray for that sickness, and people might not get better. And that does not mean that God is not good or that he's not present. There's times we're going to pray for marriages that are struggling, and those marriages are still going to break up. And there's times we're going to pray for children that are rebelling. And maybe they'll turn the corner and maybe they won't. And you can be anxious throughout that entire period, or you can have the peace of knowing that God is eternal and that he is present and that he is with you. Fourth, Rob says to overcome fear, we need to engage in redemptive suffering. After any struggle, there's going to be a temptation to step into what is comfortable. And it could be that comfortable means eating. It could be that comfortable means jumping into some sort of fantasy. Comfort could be lust. Comfort could be having a drink or substance abuse. Comfort could be many different things that looks like flight, escapism. Because fear exposes vulnerability. Fear exposes emotions, and the temptation is to numb those emotions because we don't like it. God calls us to embrace suffering, and he models it to us through Jesus on earth. Fifth, Rob says, to overcome fear, you need to surrender. Surrendering brings us back to that critical question. Will you trust God when things are good? Will you trust God when things are not good? When you are fearful and you feel like you're losing control, will you take care of things, or will you surrender? Will you let go? Will you trust God? Sixth and finally, overcoming fear involves God-directed action. Sometimes in faith, instead of taking action, we need to do nothing. And sometimes in faith, instead of doing nothing, we need to take action. How do you know the difference? It's because you've taken a step back from the situation. You've realized that not everything needs to be resolved right here, right now. Sometimes you have the opportunity to simply shift your focus from the circumstance to our Father who is in heaven. It's not about what happens over here. It's about his kingdom come. His will be done. You see, when you absolutely surrender, it changes your perspective. And when your perspective is shifted, you have a new peace that enters in. But what are we saying today? Congratulations, you're alive. Fear is present. There's no escaping it. And when you encounter it, you're going to have a fight or flight emotional response. That's to be human. It's how we created. It's what got us to this point in our journey. Some fears you can overcome through repetitive exposure, and if that's you, you should step into that space. But some fears are actually all about who we are. Who we are. Who we are. I am loved. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You are loved. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You have a purpose. There is a divine promise and destiny for you. The great tragedy in Numbers is that fear robbed them from entering into the promises of God. The great tragedy for Abraham is that fear caused him to disrespect his wife who he is closest to. Fear caused him to live with the turmoil of a relationship with multiple wives and multiple children. That wasn't the call of his life. That was the consequence of fear. Overcoming fear begins by naming it, surrendering. Freedom comes when we embrace our value at the cross. Freedom comes when we fully surrender and trust that God is with us. God is for us. God loves us. There's no fear that love, perfect love, cannot drive out. So may you fix your eyes on God. May you experience his presence, peace, as you daily overcome the obstacles that cause you fear. Let me pray as we enter into a season and time of worship. Father, I thank you that we get to sit here together. I thank you as we enter into this time of worship through music, that we get to think about how you do deliver us, how you can deliver us, how your heart for us is not for us to be trapped in our bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens, but for us to live lives fully today and forevermore. Father, would you help us to press into the tricky conversations at home and at work? Would you help us to know where our identity is being challenged by something that is not of you? Would you give us the courage to fix our eyes on you and to live free? In your mighty name I pray. Amen.
Let's stand and continue to worship.